The doctor looked at me and said, "I need you to give me a few minutes alone with your son." "Why? My son Kyle is only 6. Don't you need me around?" I asked, immediately worried. "Yes, but I need to conduct a private developmental assessment, doctor," Kelly responded coolly. I hesitated. "A what?" "He's never needed one before. It's just standard for his age group. New protocols." I wanted to say no, but she was already opening the door and gesturing me out. I stepped into the hallway because it's not like I could really argue with a doctor. But something still felt off. So I stood right outside the door, listening in to their conversation. Her questions were even more alarming. "Are you happy at home? Has anyone ever laid their hands on you? Do mommy and daddy fight a lot?" I felt my heart race. Was she building a CPS case against me? I tried to think if there was anything that could have been misinterpreted. Kyle had scraped his knee last week at the playground. Was that it? My mind was racing through every possible scenario where someone might think we were bad parents. Dr. Kelly opened the door and smiled at me. "We're all done. I'd like to schedule a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks." "A follow-up? This is just a routine checkup, right? Isn't he completely healthy?" I asked, panicking that something was wrong with Kyle. "I just want to double-check on something," she said vaguely. I couldn't help but feel suspicious. I insisted on staying in the same room 2 weeks later. Her smile faltered. "The assessment works better when it's just me and Kyle," she argued, but I refused to budge. She looked disappointed, but nodded. She sat down on the rolling stool and pulled out a wrapped gift. Kyle's eyes widened when he unwrapped an entire Spider-Man coloring book with a whole set of markers. She opened the coloring book and started asking him sketchy questions while he picked out a marker. "What's your daily routine like, Kyle? When do you wake up? When do you go to bed? When are you usually home? Does anyone else live with you?" I stepped between them. "Why do you need to know his schedule, doctor?" Kelly looked flustered. "I'm just being thorough. Building rapport is important for ongoing care. But we can stop here. I'd like to schedule another follow-up. Actually, if it's more convenient, I could see him outside of office hours. I could even come to your home." That's when I knew something was really wrong. Pediatricians don't make house calls, not without bad intentions. So I put my foot down. "No, I'll be looking for a new doctor." I picked Kyle up in my arms and rushed out of the clinic. But things only got worse. Dr. Kelly began calling my phone every day, leaving desperate voicemails. Each one sounded even crazier than the last. I was actually scared. I blocked her number, hoping things would end there. But 3 weeks later, she showed up at our house, grinning in front of our door. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing with a white coat, holding a big present. "Hello? I have something for Kyle." I opened the door but kept the screen door locked. Kyle ran over, his eyes gleaming as he saw the gift. "Wow! Hi, Dr. Kelly! Presents!" he screamed, jumping around happily. She bent down and nodded. "It's a special Lego set, but I need to talk to you first. Can I come in for just a few minutes?" "No." I put my hand on Kyle's shoulder and pulled him back from the door. "You need to leave." Her eyes filled with tears. "Please, I just need to talk to him one more time. You don't understand. Please let me give him his present." Kyle was tugging on my shirt. "Mom, please, it's a Lego set." But I saw the manic look in her eyes. I couldn't leave it to chance. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to dial 911. That's when Dr. Kelly yanked the screen door so hard the lock snapped and frame bent. She slapped the phone right out of my hand and scooped up Kyle in her arms before I could even scream. "Kyle!" I chased after her, but she was already at her car. She threw him in the back seat and hit the locks. "Stop!" I begged. She started the car as I banged on the window. "Don't do this!" She slammed on the gas and left. I ran to my car in the garage and jumped in, hands shaking so bad I could barely start the car. I chased after the car recklessly, placing 911 on the speakers. I gave them Dr. Kelly's license plate number. "Ma'am, I need you to not engage." But I wasn't stopping. The car pulled up to the children's hospital. I screeched to a stop right behind her car and ran toward them. "Stop! Someone stop her!" 2 security guards rushed in, following Dr. Kelly down 2 hallways past other nurses and patients. She started screaming, "Look! Through the window in that bed! That's my daughter, Misty. She's dying and he's the only match. He can save her." The security guards grabbed Dr. Kelly's arms and pulled her back from the car. I yanked the back door open and reached in for Kyle. He fell into my chest and his whole body was shaking against mine. He was crying and asking why the doctor took him. I tried to answer, but my voice wouldn't work right. The words kept getting stuck in my throat. Dr. Kelly was still screaming even with the guards holding her. She kept pointing at the hospital building and yelling about her daughter Misty in that bed up there. She was saying Kyle was the only match and he could save her. I realized she actually believed this made everything okay. Like stealing my son was fine because her daughter was dying. More security guards came running from the hospital entrance. They formed a line between us and Dr. Kelly. Someone was talking on a radio calling for police. I picked Kyle up and carried him toward the hospital doors. My legs felt weird and shaky, but I kept moving. Inside the lobby, I found a corner chair away from the windows. I sat down and pulled Kyle onto my lap. I started checking him all over for any cuts or bruises. I lifted his shirt and checked his arms and legs. He kept saying he was okay, but I couldn't stop looking. A nurse in blue scrubs came over with 2 bottles of water and a blanket. She draped the blanket around Kyle's shoulders. Her voice was really soft and careful, like she was talking to something broken. That's when I realized we probably looked as messed up as I felt. Kyle was still crying a little, and I was shaking so bad the water bottle rattled in my hand. 2 police officers walked through the main doors about 10 minutes later. They had their hands on their belts and they were looking around the lobby. One of them came over to us and asked if I was the mother who called 911. I nodded and he said they needed to separate us for statements. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to let go of Kyle. But the officer explained a hospital social worker would stay with him in a family room. He pointed to a woman standing by a door with toys and books visible inside. I carried Kyle over there and the social worker smiled at him. She had a kind face and she showed him a basket of action figures. Kyle looked at me and I told him I'd be right outside. The officer led me to a small office and handed me a clipboard with forms. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't write. The letters kept blurring together on the page. He noticed and offered to write while I talked. I felt grateful because I didn't think I could hold the pen steady. I started telling him everything from the beginning. The first appointment where Dr. Kelly wanted me to leave the room. The weird questions about our home life and Kyle's schedule. The follow-up where she gave him the Spider-Man coloring book. Her offer to come to our house. The phone calls after I blocked her number. Then her showing up at our door 3 weeks later. I described how she broke through the screen door and grabbed Kyle. How I chased her car and called 911. My voice got steadier as I focused on the facts instead of how scared I was. The officer took pictures of my palms where I'd scraped them banging on her car window. He wrote down the license plate number I'd given to the 911 operator. Then he explained that detectives would follow up because this was a kidnapping case. Hearing that word made everything feel more real. It stopped my breath for a second. This wasn't just a scary doctor. This was an actual crime. Through the office window, I could see into the main lobby. Dr. Kelly was sitting in a different area talking to other officers. She kept pointing up toward the higher floors where her daughter must be. A man in a suit came over and started talking fast to the security guards. I caught pieces of what he was saying through the glass. Something about unauthorized patient contact and immediate suspension. Hearing that made me feel slightly less crazy. Like maybe I wasn't wrong to be suspicious all those times. A detective in regular clothes knocked on the office door and came in. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Magee. He asked if Kyle could be checked by a different pediatrician to write down any injuries or stress. I signed the medical release form and the pen rattled against the clipboard. I told him I needed to be there for every second of the exam. He said that was fine. We went to an exam room and Kyle was already there with the social worker. A doctor with gray hair came in and smiled at Kyle. She was older and had a gentle way of talking. Kyle held my hand tight while she checked him over. She listened to his heart and said it was beating really fast. She wrote down that he showed signs of acute stress but no physical harm. Detective Magee came back after the exam. He explained that Dr. Kelly would probably face charges for kidnapping and assault for breaking our screen door. Maybe other charges too, depending on what they found. He said we needed to come to the station tomorrow for recorded statements, but we could go home now if we felt safe. I almost laughed at that question. I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe again. But I nodded because Kyle needed his own bed. My phone started ringing while we were still in the exam room. It was Darren. His voice sounded sharp and scared. He said a neighbor saw police cars at our house. I tried to explain everything in short bursts. Detective Magee was standing there watching me with a sympathetic look. I told Darren about the screen door and the chase and the hospital. He said he was leaving work right now to meet us at home. Then I mentioned the earlier appointments and how Dr. Kelly wanted to make house calls. Darren's voice changed from scared to angry. He asked why I didn't tell him about that sooner. I felt heat rise in my chest even though I was too tired to fight. Before we could leave, a woman came through the lobby doors. She had an ID badge that said Child Protective Services. She walked over to us and introduced herself as Genesis Wise. She explained gently that they got notified because of Dr. Kelly's earlier assessments. Those questions about our home life had raised flags about a possible investigation. My stomach dropped all over again. Now I had to prove I was a good mother on top of everything else. Genesis said she needed to schedule a home visit for tomorrow afternoon. She promised this was standard protocol and not an accusation. But I could hear the concern underneath. Like maybe I should have caught this sooner. Like maybe I should have protected Kyle better. The drive home felt like I was moving through fog. Kyle sat quiet in his car seat in the back. I kept checking the rearview mirror for cars following us. Every time a car turned when we turned, my heart started racing. Then it would keep going past our street and I could breathe again. When we pulled into our driveway, I saw the screen door. It was hanging at an angle with the frame all bent. Looking at that physical damage made my hands start shaking again on the steering wheel. I forced myself to let go of the wheel and open the car door. My legs felt wobbly walking up the driveway with Kyle's hand gripped tight in mine. The screen door frame was covered in cardboard that Darren had duct taped over the bent metal and broken lock. Seeing it patched like that made everything feel worse somehow. Like we were living in a house that got broken into and never fixed right. Darren opened the front door before we reached it and pulled Kyle into a long hug, lifting him off the ground. He looked at me over Kyle's shoulder with so many questions in his eyes, but I was too tired to explain anything more than I already had on the phone. Kyle wiggled free and ran inside to check if his toys were okay, leaving us standing in the doorway. Darren touched my arm and asked if I was all right, but I just shook my head because I didn't know how to answer that. A police car pulled up 20 minutes later, and a uniformed officer got out carrying a camera and evidence bags. He took photos of the broken door frame from different angles, the flash going off over and over. Then he walked around the side of the house and came back with my phone from the bushes where it landed. dropping it into a clear plastic bag and marking it with a yellow tag. He did the same with pieces of the broken lock mechanism, labeling each one. Our house looked like a crime scene by the time he finished. He handed me a case number on a small card and said Detective McGee would follow up tomorrow about our statements. After he left, I stood in the kitchen and stared at the cardboard covering the door, thinking about how Dr. Kelly had been standing right there just hours ago. That night, Kyle woke up screaming at 11:30. I ran to his room and found him sitting up in bed, crying and saying the doctor was taking him again. I climbed into his small bed and pulled him against my chest, stroking his hair and telling him he was safe now. He kept asking if she was coming back, and I promised over and over that she couldn't get to him anymore. His body slowly stopped shaking, but it took almost an hour before he fell back asleep. I stayed there next to him, my back pressed against his dinosaur sheets and my arm going numb under his weight. Around 1 a.m, he woke up screaming again, this time about being in the car. I went through the same routine, rocking him and whispering that I wouldn't let anyone take him. By 3, he finally fell into a deeper sleep, but I couldn't close my eyes. Every sound in the house made me tense up, the refrigerator humming, the heating system clicking on, a car driving past outside. I kept my phone clutched in one hand the whole time, thumb hovering over the emergency call button, ready to dial 911 again if I heard anything wrong. My mind kept replaying the moment she grabbed him, over and over like a video I couldn't stop, the way she scooped him up so fast. The sound of the car locks clicking, his face through the window. Detective McGee called at 8 a.m. while I was making coffee. He said he needed us to come to the station that afternoon for recorded statements, probably around 2. Then he told me not to post anything about the case on social media. I hadn't even thought about Facebook or anything like that. But as soon as he said it, I realized other parents from the clinic would probably start asking questions when they heard about police at the hospital. He also mentioned that Children's Hospital had started their own investigation into how Dr. Kelly had access to Kyle and what happened with her employment there. That felt like something, but also like nothing, because it didn't explain why nobody caught this before she actually grabbed my kid. I thanked him and hung up, then just stood there holding the phone and wondering how many other families she might have done this to. Kyle came downstairs in his pajamas asking for cereal. While Kyle ate his Cheerios at the kitchen table, I sat down with a notebook and forced myself to write everything down about those earlier appointments. The first one where she wanted him alone for the developmental assessment. All those questions about whether anyone hurt him at home, whether we fought a lot. At the time, I thought maybe she was building a CPS case, but now I could see she was gathering information, learning our schedule, finding out when Kyle was home and who else lived with us. The second appointment when she brought those Spider-Man markers and asked about his daily routine, what time he woke up, what time he went to bed. She was mapping out his life like she was planning something. And then the offer to make house calls, to see him outside office hours. That wasn't kindness or good patient care. She wanted access to him without me or other medical staff around to see what she was doing. My gut knew something was wrong during those appointments. I felt it in my stomach every time. But I talked myself out of trusting it because she was a doctor, and I was just a worried mom who probably watched too many true crime shows. I should have listened to myself. I should have walked out after that first weird assessment instead of going back. At the police station, Detective McGee walked us through the process for filing an emergency restraining order. The forms asked for specific incidents and dates, so I wrote down everything. The broken screen door with the time it happened, the abduction attempt at the hospital, the house call offer that crossed boundaries, the phone calls after I blocked her. Kyle sat in a bright waiting room down the hall with a victim advocate who had toys and coloring books. I was glad he didn't have to sit there listening to me describe the worst parts again. Detective McGee was patient while I filled out each section, checking that I included enough detail. He explained that the judge would review it quickly, probably by tomorrow, and we'd get a temporary order while waiting for a full hearing. The paperwork felt both important and useless at the same time. Important because it was official protection. Useless because a piece of paper wouldn't actually stop someone who already broke through our door. But I signed everything and handed it back, hoping it would at least create consequences if she tried to contact us again. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman named Deborah Stokes introduced herself as someone from the hospital's risk management department. She said Dr. Kelly had been suspended immediately while they investigated what happened. Her voice was professional, but I could hear the concern underneath, like she was worried about the hospital getting sued. She asked careful questions about our appointments. Had I signed any unusual consent forms? Had Dr. Kelly ever asked me to authorize anything out of the ordinary? I told her about the developmental assessment and the house call offer. I heard typing in the background, fast clicking like she was taking detailed notes. She promised that their patient safety committee would review all the protocols around when doctors can see patients alone and how staff access medical records. It felt like they were trying to cover themselves legally, but at least they were taking it seriously. She gave me her direct number and said to call if I remembered anything else that seemed wrong about our interactions with Dr. Kelly. The next day, a doctor named Wu Logan called me through Detective McGee. He said he was a transplant physician and wanted to discuss the medical ethics of what happened, if I was willing. We met at a small office in a medical building that wasn't connected to Children's Hospital. He had gray hair and a calm way of talking that made me feel less defensive. He explained that real bone marrow donation requires extensive informed consent from everyone involved. Genetic counseling, psychological evaluation, Multiple appointments where they make sure the donor and the family understand all the risks. He said even if Kyle had been a match for her daughter, coercing or tricking a family into donation violates every ethical standard in transplant medicine. Any tissue obtained through Dr. Kelly's methods would be completely inadmissible for transplant anyway. The transplant center would never accept it. She couldn't have used whatever she got from Kyle even if her plan had worked. He emphasized that he wasn't defending her actions, just helping me understand that legitimate donation is nothing like what she tried to do. I felt a little better knowing that proper donation involves so much protection for donors, but it also made me realize how far outside normal boundaries she had gone. 3 days after the hospital incident, Detective McGee called with news that made my stomach turn. The crime lab had analyzed those Spider-Man markers Dr. Kelly gave Kyle during the second appointment. They found traces of saliva on the marker tips. He explained that she probably had Kyle test them by putting them in his mouth briefly, which would collect cheek cells for genetic testing. The lab was still analyzing whether she actually got usable DNA, but the intent was obvious. I felt sick remembering how excited Kyle was about those markers, how she turned his trust and happiness into a tool for her plan. She coached my 6-year-old to give her a DNA sample without him or me knowing what was happening. That felt even more violating than the physical grabbing somehow. The grabbing was violent and scary, but at least it was obvious. This was sneaky and manipulative, using his innocence against him. Detective McGee said this would likely add charges related to unauthorized genetic collection and possibly child endangerment depending on what the prosecutor decided. Genesis Wise called later that week and said she had some referrals for child therapists who specialize in medical trauma. She found someone with immediate openings, which felt like a miracle, because I'd heard therapy waitlists could be months long. The therapist's name was Dr. Sarah Chen, and she called me directly to schedule an intake appointment for next week. Her voice was warm, and she explained gently that Kyle might show some regression over the next few weeks. Sleep problems, which we were already seeing. Fear of medical settings. Maybe some separation anxiety. She said kids are really resilient when they have proper support, and that gave me the first small bit of hope I'd felt since this whole thing started. She asked some basic questions about Kyle's personality and what happened, taking notes. Then she said she'd have toys and art supplies ready for his first session, that sometimes kids his age express things better through play than words. I felt grateful that Genesis had connected us so quickly, instead of making us figure it out alone. By the weekend, word had spread through our neighborhood and Kyle's school. My phone kept buzzing with texts from other parents. Most were supportive, offering to bring meals or help with anything we needed. But mixed in were messages from a local parents' Facebook group that someone had screenshotted and sent me. People were speculating about whether there was abuse in our home that triggered a CPS investigation, whether Dr. Kelly had seen signs of something wrong and we were covering it up. I felt humiliated reading strangers discuss my family like we were suspects instead of victims. Part of me wanted to post a long explanation defending ourselves, setting the record straight. But Detective McGee had specifically warned me not to post anything public about the case, so I just had to sit there and let people gossip, knowing some of them would probably always wonder if maybe we did something wrong. Darren found me reading the Facebook comments and took my phone away, reminding me that anyone who mattered knew the truth. But it still hurt knowing our names were being dragged through rumors we couldn't even respond to. That night after Kyle finally fell asleep, Darren and I stood in the kitchen speaking in harsh whispers so we wouldn't wake him. He wanted to sue the hospital right away, get money for therapy, and maybe move somewhere safer. I kept saying we needed to focus on the criminal case first, make sure Dr. Kelly actually got punished instead of just handing us a check to keep quiet. His face was red and his hands kept clenching into fists. He said we needed the money now, that his boss was already giving him trouble about missing work, and we couldn't afford all the therapy Kyle was going to need. I felt my own anger rising because it wasn't about the money for me. It was about making sure she couldn't do this to another family. We went back and forth, voices getting louder until we both remembered Kyle sleeping upstairs and forced ourselves quieter. Darren said I was being stubborn and not thinking about our actual needs. I said he was being selfish and only caring about bills instead of justice. Then we were both crying, exhausted and scared, sitting at the kitchen table with our heads in our hands. Neither of us could admit the other might have a point, because we were both so tired and afraid that we couldn't see past our own panic. Eventually, we just went to bed without resolving anything, lying on opposite sides with our backs to each other. The next morning, Genesis Wise showed up for her home visit right at 9 o'clock like she'd scheduled. She walked through every room with a clipboard, checking that we had working smoke detectors and that Kyle's bedroom was clean and safe. She asked Kyle gentle questions about his daily routine while I stood nearby trying not to look nervous. Did he have his own bed? Did he eat regular meals? Did he feel safe here? Kyle answered honestly, showing her his toys and his favorite stuffed animals. She opened cabinets in the kitchen and looked in the fridge, writing notes on her forms. I felt like I was judged for every dirty dish and unmade bed, even though the house was cleaner than it had been in months, because I'd spent all morning preparing. Genesis moved through the bathroom, the living room, even the garage. She checked the broken screen door that still had cardboard taped over it, and made a note about getting it properly fixed. After about an hour, she sat down at the kitchen table with me while Kyle played in the other room. She told me clearly that I wasn't under investigation, that this was just protocol because of Dr. Kelly's questions during those appointments. She said my quick response to the boundary problems actually showed I was a protective parent, not a neglectful one. Her words made something tight in my chest suddenly loosen. I hadn't realized how scared I was that they'd think I was a bad mother until she told me I wasn't. She signed some papers and left copies for my records, promising the case would be officially closed within a week. Walking her to the door, I felt lighter than I had since this whole thing started. That afternoon, I drove to Kyle's school with copies of the restraining order in a folder. The principal met me in her office and listened carefully while I explained what happened. We created a safety plan together. Password-protected pickup so no one could take Kyle without knowing the secret word we'd chosen. A photo of Dr. Kelly for the front office staff with explicit instructions that she was never allowed on the school grounds. Written documentation that no one claiming to be medical personnel could remove Kyle without my direct permission, and a phone call to verify. The principal was supportive and kind, suggesting we also meet with Kyle's teacher to discuss any behavior changes to watch for. She said the school counselor was available if Kyle needed someone to talk to during the day. Walking out of that meeting to my car, I felt like I'd regained a small piece of control over our situation. At least at the school he'd be protected. At least there were systems in place now. By Friday, exactly 1 week after the hospital incident, Detective Majee called to say the hospital's attorney wanted to discuss settlement terms. They were offering to cover policy changes and compensation for what we'd been through. Darren saw this as proof they knew they were liable, that they'd screwed up by letting Dr. Kelly have so much access to Kyle. I saw it as them trying to avoid worse publicity, trying to make the problem go away with money before more people found out. But I was too tired to be purely negative about it. We agreed to hear what they were offering once things calmed down a bit, once we weren't in pure survival mode anymore. Detective Majee said he'd set up a meeting for the following week. 2 days later, a certified mail envelope arrived requiring my signature. Inside was a letter from Dr. Kelly's defense attorney, carefully worded and obviously written by a lawyer. It expressed remorse for actions taken under extreme emotional distress. It asked us to consider the impossible position of a mother watching her child die. The language was so calculated, so manipulative, trying to make us feel guilty for not helping. I felt my anger spike reading it, my hands shaking as I held the paper. But underneath the anger was an uncomfortable thread of empathy I didn't want to acknowledge. She was a mother too. Her daughter was dying. That didn't excuse what she did, not even close. But I couldn't completely ignore the desperation behind it. I shoved the letter back in the envelope and put it in a drawer where I wouldn't have to look at it. Detective Majee called again a few days later with an update about the criminal case. The district attorney's office was building charges that would include kidnapping, assault, and multiple HIPAA violations for accessing Kyle's medical records without any legitimate reason. The prosecutor wanted to meet with us before filing formal charges to make sure we understood the process and timeline. Hearing that professionals were taking this seriously, that there would be real consequences, helped me feel less like I was screaming into a void. It felt like the system was actually working for once, like people with power were listening and acting. That evening, I was scrolling through news on my laptop when I saw an article about pediatric transplant shortages and donor registries. It featured a case about a young girl who needed bone marrow, describing her illness and the desperate search for a match. They didn't name Dr. Kelly or connect it to the abduction, but I recognized details from what she'd screamed through the car window at the hospital. My heart ached for a sick child even as I stayed furious at her mother. I kept reading, learning about how rare matches can be, how many kids die waiting. Darren caught me reading and gently closed my laptop. He reminded me that feeling compassion for Misty didn't mean I had to forgive what was done to Kyle. The two things could exist separately. I knew he was right, but it still felt complicated and messy in my head. 2 weeks after everything happened, I was at the grocery store trying to return to normal routines. I was in the cereal aisle comparing prices when a woman approached me. She introduced herself as Misty's aunt, her eyes already red and swollen from crying. She started begging me to at least let Kyle be tested, insisting that Dr. Kelly never meant to hurt anyone, and that Misty was running out of time. I felt trapped between the shelves and her desperation, my voice shaking as I tried to tell her to step back. I reminded her that any further contact violated the restraining order. She kept pleading, reaching toward me, and I backed away until a store manager noticed and intervened. I abandoned my cart right there in the aisle and walked quickly to my car. My hands were trembling so hard I couldn't drive for 10 minutes. I just sat there in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel and trying to breathe. When I finally calmed down enough, I called Wu Logan from the car. I asked him specific questions about what voluntary testing would actually involve for Kyle if we ever considered it. He explained the cheek swab process, the probability of matching, and what bone marrow donation would mean if a match were confirmed. He emphasized it was generally safe but not without risks, that Kyle would need anesthesia and recovery time. He didn't pressure me either way, just provided information in a calm, professional voice. I appreciated that he treated me like an intelligent person making a difficult decision, not like someone who needed to be convinced. I wasn't seriously considering it, but knowing the facts helped me feel less guilty about my firm no. A few days later, Detective Majee called with information that made everything feel even more wrong. The covert genetic test Dr. Kelly attempted was both inadmissible for medical use and likely contaminated by improper collection methods. Even if it showed a match, any legitimate transplant center would require a fresh test with proper consent and counseling. This means her entire scheme was medically pointless in addition to being criminal. She traumatized my son for absolutely nothing. The markers couldn't have given her usable results anyway. All that fear and violation was for a test that would never have worked. Somehow that made it feel even worse, knowing she'd put us through hell for something that was never going to help her daughter anyway. A few days later, I was at the pharmacy parking lot picking up Kyle's sleep medication when he suddenly froze next to the cart return. His eyes locked on something across the lot and his breathing started coming in short gasps. I followed his gaze and saw a woman in a white lab coat walking into the medical building attached to the pharmacy. She wasn't even looking our direction, but Kyle grabbed my arm so hard his nails dug into my skin. He started hyperventilating and crying, saying the doctor was coming to get him again. I dropped to my knees right there on the asphalt and pulled him close, pressing his face against my shoulder. His whole body shook and I could feel his heart pounding through his thin shirt. I tried the breathing technique the therapist taught us, counting out loud and exaggerating my own breaths so he could match them. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. But he kept gasping and crying, his words coming out broken between sobs about the car and the hospital. Other shoppers walked past giving us concerned looks, but I didn't care. I just kept counting breaths and rubbing circles on his back like the therapist showed me. It took almost 20 minutes before his breathing slowed down and the shaking stopped. When he finally lifted his head, his face was red and blotchy, his eyes exhausted. He leaned against me like all his energy was gone, and I had to carry him back to the car even though he's getting too big for that. I buckled him into his seat and he immediately curled up holding his knees. I sat in the driver's seat with the door open and called the therapist from my cell. Her receptionist said she was fully booked, but when I explained what just happened, she put me on hold. 2 minutes later, the therapist came back with an opening at 4 that afternoon. I thanked her about 5 times and drove home with Kyle silent in the back seat. At the session that afternoon, the therapist gave Kyle a small weighted stuffed animal, a blue dog that fit in his palm. She explained that the weight would help ground him when he felt scared, and that he could squeeze it as hard as he needed. Kyle held it the entire drive home and took it to bed with him that night. The next evening, Darren came home from work looking more stressed than usual. We got Kyle settled with his dinner and cartoons in the living room and sat down at the kitchen table with our own plates. Darren pushed his food around for a minute before admitting his boss had pulled him aside that morning. Apparently his performance had been slipping and he'd missed too many days. His boss understood about the family emergency, but made it clear the company needed him focused, or they'd have to reconsider his position. Darren's voice got tight when he said he couldn't afford to lose this job on top of everything else. He brought up the hospital settlement again, saying we should just take whatever they offered quickly. The money would give us a cushion if he did get fired and we could stop worrying about one thing at least. I understood where he was coming from, but something in me resisted being rushed. I didn't want the hospital to get off easy just because we were desperate. We went back and forth for a while, both of us getting frustrated, until finally we agreed to at least hear their full offer before making any decisions. We needed to approach this as a team, even though we were both falling apart in different ways. Kyle called from the living room asking for more juice and we both got up, grateful for the interruption. 3 days later, we met with the prosecutor at her office downtown. She was a thin woman in her 40s with glasses and a no-nonsense attitude. She laid out folders on the conference table and explained that the DA was building a strong case, but we needed to be prepared for what the defense would argue. She said Dr. Kelly's attorney would likely claim that our parenting created opportunities for access, and that we should have recognized warning signs sooner. The words hit me like a slap, and I felt shame flooding through my chest even though I knew it wasn't fair. The prosecutor must have seen my face change because she immediately added that this was just standard defense tactics and not a reflection of reality. She was preparing us for the emotional toll of having our choices questioned in court. She emphasized that the evidence clearly showed Dr. Kelly's predatory behavior, and that blaming parents were a common strategy that rarely worked. I appreciated her honesty even as I dreaded actually sitting in a courtroom hearing someone say those things out loud. Darren reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. The prosecutor spent another hour walking us through the timeline and what to expect at the preliminary hearing. When we left, I felt both validated and exhausted, knowing this process was going to be even harder than I'd imagined. 2 weeks later, Deborah from the hospital called my cell while I was folding laundry. She informed me that the state medical board had formally opened an investigation into Dr. Kelly's license. The hospital had also fully revoked her clinical privileges pending the outcome of both the criminal case and the board review. It felt like a real consequence finally, even though Deborah cautioned that the process could take months. I asked whether other families should be notified if their children had been Dr. Kelly's patients. Deborah said the hospital was already reviewing all of her recent cases for any similar boundary violations. She promised they were taking this seriously and implementing new protocols around unsupervised assessments. After we hung up, I stood there holding my phone, feeling like maybe the system was actually working for once. The next afternoon, my cell rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a woman's voice immediately launched into questions about the pediatrician transplant case. She identified herself as a reporter from the local newspaper and asked if I'd be willing to comment. I felt my stomach drop and asked how she got my number. She deflected and tried again to get me to confirm details about the abduction and Dr. Kelly's daughter. I said I had no comment and hung up, my hands shaking. I immediately called Detective McGee and told him what happened. He sighed and said media attention was inevitable given the unusual circumstances, but reminded me I had absolutely no obligation to participate. He suggested a simple no-comment response to any future calls, which felt like permission to protect our privacy. He also said he'd look into how the reporter got my personal number since that information should have been protected. That same week, an anonymous package appeared on our front porch. I saw it through the window when I got home from picking Kyle up at the school. My first instinct was panic, and I immediately called the police before even touching it. 2 uniformed officers arrived within 15 minutes and carefully opened the box on our lawn. Inside were 3 children's books about being brave, with bright, colorful covers and positive messages. There was no note and no return address. The officers photographed everything and took the books as potential evidence, even though they said it was probably just a well-meaning gesture from someone who'd heard about our situation. But standing there watching them document it, I couldn't stop shaking. In my current state, everything felt like a threat. One of the officers, a younger guy with kind eyes, told me this was a completely normal trauma response. He said my brain was in hypervigilance mode, trying to keep Kyle safe, and that it would ease up over time. His words helped me feel slightly less crazy, but I still checked the porch 3 times that night before bed. A few days after that, Detective McGee called and asked if I could meet him at Dr. Kelly's clinic to walk through exactly what happened during each appointment. I didn't want to go back there, but I understood why he needed me to reconstruct the timeline. Darren stayed home with Kyle, and I drove to the clinic alone, my stomach in knots the whole way. Detective McGee was waiting in the parking lot, and we went inside together. The clinic manager met us looking nervous and cooperative, clearly worried about liability. Walking into that exam room where Dr. Kelly had asked Kyle all those invasive questions made my skin crawl. The walls were still the same cheerful yellow with cartoon animals painted near the ceiling. I forced myself to stand in the spot where I'd interrupted her questioning and described exactly what I'd heard and seen. Detective McGee took detailed notes and photographed the room from different angles. We requested security footage from the hallways, and the manager immediately agreed, saying she'd have IT pull everything from the relevant dates. She kept apologizing and saying they had no idea Dr. Kelly was behaving inappropriately. I believed her, but it didn't make me feel any better about how long the behavior had gone unnoticed. About a week later, Detective McGee called with new information that made everything feel even more calculated. The hospital's IT department had pulled audit logs showing that Dr. Kelly accessed Kyle's electronic medical chart multiple times outside of appointment dates. She'd looked at his birth records, his family history, his blood type, all without any legitimate medical reason. Each unauthorized access was a separate HIPAA violation, and the pattern showed clear premeditation. This wasn't a desperate mother having a sudden breakdown. This was someone who'd been planning and gathering information over weeks. Detective McGee said the DA was adding the HIPAA violations to the charges, and that this evidence would be hard for the defense to explain away. I felt a strange sense of vindication hearing this. My instincts had been right all along. Something had been wrong from that very first appointment, and now there was proof. The court date for the permanent restraining order finally arrived about a month after the abduction attempt. I had to sit in the same courtroom as Dr. Kelly for the first time since that day at the hospital. She sat at the defense table looking exhausted and hollow, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her attorney stood and argued that she'd been acting under extreme emotional distress watching her daughter die, that her actions came from maternal desperation rather than malice. I watched Dr. Kelly start crying when her attorney mentioned Misty's condition, and I felt an unwelcome stab of pity. But then I looked across the room at Kyle sitting with the victim advocate, holding his weighted blue dog, and I remembered the absolute terror in his eyes when she grabbed him. My resolve hardened immediately. The prosecutor presented the evidence methodically, including the unauthorized chart access and the covert DNA collection attempt. She emphasized the calculated nature of Dr. Kelly's behavior and the ongoing threat to our family's safety. The judge listened carefully to both sides, taking notes and asking occasional questions. When the judge finally spoke, he granted a 1-year restraining order with specific provisions. Dr. Kelly could only access medical facilities for her daughter's care, and only under supervision. She had to stay at least 500 feet from our home, Kyle's school, and any location where we had regular appointments. The order wasn't permanent, but it was something concrete. Walking out of the courthouse afterward, I felt both relieved and unsettled. This was just one piece of a much longer process, and I knew we had months of legal proceedings still ahead. Darren put his arm around my shoulders, and we walked to the car together, Kyle between us holding both our hands. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as we drive away from the courthouse, my mind already churning through what comes next instead of celebrating the small victory we just won. 2 days later, I find myself walking through the hospital corridors on a different floor entirely, telling myself I'm just cutting through to reach the parking garage faster. But my feet slow down when I pass the pediatric intensive care unit wing, and I see the name on the door directory. I shouldn't look, but I do anyway, glancing through the observation window into one of the rooms where a small figure lies surrounded by beeping machines and IV poles. The girl has no hair, and her skin looks pale against the white sheets, and even from this distance I can see how thin her arms are. This is Misty. This is the child doctor Kelly was trying to save when she grabbed my son. My chest tightens with an emotion I don't want to name because it feels like betraying Kyle to feel anything except anger. She's just a kid who didn't ask to be sick and didn't ask her mother to do something terrible. But understanding why Dr. Kelly acted doesn't make what she did okay, and it doesn't erase the fear in Kyle's eyes when she took him. I turn away quickly before anyone notices me standing there, and I walk fast toward the exit, carrying the complicated mess of those feelings with me like a weight I can't put down. When I get home that evening, Darren is waiting in the kitchen with a serious expression that tells me he's been thinking about something all day. He suggests we should consider moving to a neighboring town where Kyle could start over at a different school without everyone knowing him as that kid whose doctor tried to kidnap him. I feel my shoulders tense up immediately because moving feels like running away and letting Dr. Kelly win somehow. I tell him that uprooting Kyle from his friends and everything familiar would just add more trauma on top of what he's already dealing with. Darren argues that a fresh start might be exactly what Kyle needs, and that staying here means constantly running into people who know what happened. We go back and forth until both our voices are raised and we're saying the same points over and over, getting nowhere except more frustrated. Finally, we both run out of steam and sit at the kitchen table in exhausted silence. I suggest we wait and ask Kyle's therapist what would actually be better for him instead of just guessing. Darren agrees to that compromise and we leave it there for now. Neither of us happy, but at least not fighting anymore. 3 days later, Genesis Wise comes by for what she says will be her final home visit. She walks through the house one more time, checking the new lock on the screen door and noting all the safety measures we've put in place. She sits down with us at the dining table and tells us officially that the CPS case is closed because our home is safe and we've done everything right to protect Kyle. She mentions how quickly we responded to the threats and how we got Kyle into therapy right away, and she says those actions show good protective parenting. Before she leaves, she hands me a letter on official letterhead, stating that the investigation found no concerns about our parenting and that the case is closed. I fold that letter carefully and put it in a file folder in my desk drawer, treating it like some kind of shield against future accusations, even though Genesis tells me I won't need it. But I feel better having it there anyway, proof in writing that we didn't do anything wrong. The next afternoon, my phone rings with a number I recognize as the hospital transplant department. I answer cautiously and hear Wu Logan's voice telling me he has some unexpected news. He explains that a potential bone marrow match for Misty has been found through the National Registry, someone who lives across the country and has no connection to our family at all. The donor is going through additional testing to confirm they're compatible, and if everything checks out, Misty could receive a transplant within a few weeks. I feel this strange rush of relief flood through me, knowing for certain now that Kyle is completely out of the picture, and that Misty might actually get help from someone who chose to donate properly. I thank Wu for letting me know, and after we hang up, I sit there for a minute feeling like maybe this whole nightmare could have an ending where everyone gets something they need. 2 days later, an email arrives from Dr. Kelly's defense attorney with a formal proposal for something called a restorative mediation session. The attorney writes that Dr. Kelly wants a chance to make a direct statement to us explaining her actions and taking accountability as part of her rehabilitation process. I read the email 3 times trying to figure out if this is genuine remorse or just a legal strategy to make her look better in court. I mention it to my therapist at my next appointment, and she suggests that mediation could provide closure if I go in with very clear boundaries about what I will and won't accept. But when I bring it up to Darren that night, he's immediately against it, calling it manipulation and saying, Dr. Kelly doesn't deserve any more of our time or attention. We agree to think about it separately before making any decision, because we're both too raw to discuss it calmly right now. The following week, I'm sitting in the waiting room during Kyle's therapy session when he comes out early looking confused. The therapist asks if she can speak with me privately and brings me into her office while Kyle goes back to the play area. She tells me that Kyle mentioned something concerning during their session about the Spider-Man markers Dr. Kelly gave him at that second appointment. Apparently, Kyle said the markers tasted like medicine when he tried them. The therapist's whole demeanor changed when she heard that, and she asked Kyle to describe exactly what happened. Kyle explained that Dr. Kelly told him to test if the markers worked by putting the tip in his mouth briefly to see if the color showed up on his tongue. My stomach turns over as I realize what she did, how she coached my 6-year-old son to give her a DNA sample without him even knowing what was happening. The therapist is already typing notes into her computer, and she tells me she's required to share this information with Detective Magee because it's potential evidence of additional manipulation and coercion. I feel sick driving home because every time I think I understand the full scope of what Dr. Kelly did, another layer gets revealed that makes it worse. Detective Magee calls me the next morning to confirm he received the therapist's report and that he's passing it along to the district attorney's office. He explains that this new detail about coaching Kyle to provide DNA makes the case even stronger and shows more premeditation than they originally thought. A week later, Detective Magee calls again with an update that the DA has filed formal charges including kidnapping, assault, unauthorized genetic collection, and multiple HIPAA violations for accessing Kyle's medical records without legitimate reason. He mentions that Dr. Kelly's attorney had been pushing hard for a plea deal with reduced charges, but these new details about the markers have made the DA less willing to negotiate leniently. The case is now on track for a preliminary hearing where they'll present evidence to a judge. Detective Magee warns me that we'll likely need to testify at some point and that the process could take several more months. I feel both vindicated that the system is taking this seriously and exhausted at the thought of more court dates and reliving everything again. That same afternoon, the prosecutor calls and asks if I'd be willing to prepare a victim impact statement to be read at sentencing if there's a conviction or if Dr. Kelly takes a plea deal. She explains that the statement should describe in my own words how the crime affected our family. I agree to write it, and that night after Kyle goes to bed, I sit at my laptop and start typing. I write about how Kyle used to love going to the doctor, and now he panics in parking lots when he sees white coats. I write about the broken screen door and how it made our home feel violated. I write about the fear that someone we trusted used that trust as a weapon against us. The words come easier than I expected, and I find my voice getting stronger and clearer with each paragraph, organizing all the anger and fear into something concrete that can be heard and recorded. 6 weeks pass before the forensic interview is scheduled. I drive Kyle to a special child advocacy center that's designed to be less intimidating than a police station. A trained interviewer explains to both of us that she'll be asking Kyle questions about what happened, and that the session will be recorded for potential use in court. She tells me gently that I can't be in the room during the interview, because it's protocol to prevent any appearance of coaching or influencing Kyle's answers. The thought of not being there while a stranger asks my son about the worst experience of his life feels like torture, but I understand the rules exist for good reasons. Kyle goes into the interview room holding his weighted blue dog, and I sit in the waiting area watching the clock. 40 minutes crawl by before the door opens, and Kyle comes out looking tired but not upset. He tells me he answered all the questions and that he got to draw a picture of our family at the end with special markers. The interviewer walks over and tells me quietly that Kyle did great, that his account was clear and consistent, and that he was very brave. She says the recording will be available to the prosecutor and that it should help the case significantly. I hug Kyle tight and tell him how proud I am of him. The next week, a thick envelope arrives by certified mail from the hospital's legal department. Inside is their official settlement offer with multiple pages of terms and conditions. The offer includes full coverage of Kyle's therapy costs for up to 5 years with no caps or limits, financial compensation for our trauma, and Darren's lost wages from missing work, money to repair the broken screen door and replace my damaged phone, and a commitment to implement new hospital-wide protocols around unsupervised patient assessments and staff access to medical records. The dollar amounts are significant but not outrageous, and the policy changes feel like they might actually prevent this from happening to another family. Darren reads through it that evening and wants to accept immediately, because the money would give us real financial security and let us focus completely on Kyle's recovery. I want our own attorney to review every word first, because I don't trust the hospital's lawyers to have our best interests in mind. We compromise by scheduling a meeting with a lawyer who specializes in medical malpractice cases to evaluate whether the offer is actually fair or if we should push for more. The lawyer we hired to review the settlement meets with us on a Tuesday afternoon and spends 2 hours going through every clause with a highlighter and sticky notes. She points out that the therapy coverage is actually quite generous, and that the non-disclosure language is pretty standard for these cases, though she suggests we push for an exception that lets us share safety lessons with other parents without naming the hospital specifically. Darren keeps asking about the dollar amount and whether it's fair for what we went through, and she explains that medical malpractice settlements are complicated, because juries are unpredictable and trials are expensive and traumatic. She thinks the offer is reasonable, but says we could probably negotiate another $10,000 or $15,000 if we're willing to wait a few more months. I'm scrolling through my phone while they talk numbers, and that's when I see the news alert. The headline reads, "Bone marrow donor candidate disqualified due to medical complications," and my stomach drops because I know exactly which case they're talking about, even though they don't name Misty. I click through and read that the potential donor who was evaluated for a pediatric leukemia patient has been found to have a previously undiagnosed autoimmune condition that makes donation too risky. The article talks about how devastating it is when a match falls through and how the search continues through the National Registry. I feel this weird twisted knot in my chest because part of me is sad for a dying kid, and part of me is relieved that the pressure is off us, and part of me feels guilty for being relieved. Darren notices I've gone quiet and leans over to see what I'm reading. He closes my phone gently and reminds me that Misty's medical situation is not our responsibility, and that having boundaries doesn't make me a bad person or heartless. I nod, but the knot doesn't go away, because knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two completely different things. 2 months pass, and life settles into this strange new rhythm where we're healing, but also waiting for the legal system to grind forward. Kyle has therapy every week, and I have therapy every other week, and Darren joined me for a few couples sessions to work through the stress that almost broke us. The lawyer negotiated the settlement terms we wanted, and we signed the papers, though the actual check won't come for another few weeks because of processing times. I'm at the grocery store on a Saturday morning, loading bags into the trunk of my car in the parking garage, when my phone rings with a number I recognize as the hospital. For a second, I panic thinking something went wrong with the settlement, but then I see it's Wu Logan calling, and I remember he said he'd keep me updated as a courtesy. I answer, and he tells me that another potential donor has emerged from the registry, a young man in his 20s from another state who's a strong preliminary match for Misty. They're doing confirmatory testing now to make sure the match is as good as it looks, and if everything checks out, he's already told the transplant coordinator that he's willing to donate. Wu's voice is cautiously hopeful when he explains that this donor is healthy and motivated, and that if the testing confirms the match, Misty could have her transplant within a month. I find myself smiling as I thank him for letting me know, surprised by how much I genuinely want this to work out. I want there to be a path forward for Misty that has nothing to do with my family, where she gets help through the right channels from someone who chose to be on that registry. After we hang up, I stand there in the parking garage for a minute feeling lighter than I have in weeks, Like maybe there's a version of this story where Misty survives and Dr. Kelly faces consequences and we all move forward separately. I'm reaching for the last grocery bag when I hear footsteps behind me, and then a voice I recognize instantly. Dr. Kelly steps out from between two parked cars, her face desperate and thin, and I freeze with my hand still on the shopping cart. She's violating the restraining order just by being here, but before I can say anything, she starts talking fast about the new potential donor, and how she's sorry, and how she just needed me to know that Misty might be okay. Her words tumble over each other in this manic rush, and I can see she's been crying, her eyes red and her hands shaking. I force myself to stay calm even though my heart is pounding, remembering what the therapist taught me about not engaging with people who cross boundaries. I tell her firmly that I'm glad about the donor, but that she needs to leave immediately because she's breaking the law by being here. She takes a step closer and I pull my phone out of my pocket, holding it up so she can see I'm serious. She starts crying harder and puts her hands up like she's surrendering, backing away toward the parking garage exit while apologizing over and over. I dial 911 and give them my location and a description of her car, watching as she gets in a gray sedan and drives away. The operator stays on the line with me until a police car arrives about 10 minutes later, and I'm shaking by then, but I'm also weirdly proud of myself for staying composed and calling for help, instead of yelling or engaging. The police take my statement right there in the parking garage and radio in Dr. Kelly's license plate number and vehicle description. Within an hour, Detective Magee calls me to say they located and detained her at her apartment based on my information. He explains that the DA is filing an emergency motion to revoke her bail, or at least impose much stricter conditions because she violated the restraining order in a pretty clear way. I have to go down to the station that afternoon to give a formal statement, and I describe the parking garage encounter in as much detail as I can remember. I emphasize that she didn't threaten me directly or try to touch me, but that her presence felt threatening given everything that happened before. My hands are shaking while I sign the statement form, and Detective Magee notices, offering me water and telling me I did exactly the right thing by calling immediately. He says the violation is serious because it shows she's not respecting the court's orders and that the judge will probably come down hard on this. I leave the station feeling drained but also strangely empowered, like I proved to myself that I can handle scary situations without falling apart. The emergency hearing happens the next day, and I have to testify about the parking garage encounter. The judge listens to my description, and then to Dr. Kelly's lawyer trying to explain that she only wanted to share good news and meant no harm. The judge cuts him off and says that intent doesn't matter when someone violates a restraining order and that Dr. Kelly has shown she can't be trusted to stay away from my family. He modifies the restraining order to include GPS monitoring through an ankle bracelet and home confinement, except for medical appointments related to Misty's care, which have to be approved in advance and supervised. The hospital board representative stands up and announces that they're also moving to formally revoke Dr. Kelly's medical license, pending the outcome of the criminal case, which means she can't practice medicine anymore, even if the criminal charges somehow got dropped. Walking out of that courthouse, I feel like the system is finally taking the threat seriously and putting real barriers between her desperation and my family's safety. Darren meets me in the parking lot and hugs me for a long time, and I realize I'm not scared anymore, just tired and ready for all of this to be over. 3 months after the abduction, Kyle is showing real progress that I can actually see and measure. He's sleeping through most nights without nightmares, maybe waking up scared once a week instead of every single night. His panic episodes are less frequent and less intense, and when they do happen, he can usually use the coping tools his therapist taught him, instead of just melting down. He started talking about the scary doctor in past tense, saying things like, when that happened, instead of, what if it happens again? He still gets nervous around medical settings, and sometimes freezes up when he sees someone in a white coat, but he can usually work through it with breathing exercises and his weighted stuffed animal. His therapist tells me this is excellent progress for the timeline, and that kids' brains are remarkably good at healing when they feel safe and supported. She reminds me that he might always have some sensitivity around medical situations, but that doesn't mean he's permanently damaged. Watching him laugh with his friends at a playdate, I let myself believe her. Our daily routines have shifted into a new version of normal that's different from before, but not entirely defined by trauma. I still check the locks twice before bed, and I still look over my shoulder in parking lots. But these feel like reasonable precautions rather than panic responses. We still have a safety plan for school pickup with passwords and approved adults, but it's just part of our routine now instead of this constant source of anxiety. Kyle has playdates again and goes to birthday parties, and he laughs at cartoons and plays with his toys. There are whole hours where I don't think about Dr. Kelly at all, where my brain isn't scanning for threats or replaying the worst moments. The hypervigilance is fading into something more like appropriate caution, and I'm learning to trust that we can be both careful and okay at the same time. Darren and I have date nights again, and we talk about normal things like bills and home repairs, instead of just the case and the trauma. It's not perfect, and some days are harder than others, but we're building a life that includes what happened without being completely consumed by it. The civil settlement with the hospital gets finalized after our attorney negotiates slightly better terms on a few points. They agree to cover Kyle's therapy with no annual cap for 5 years instead of their original offer of 3 years. And they add a provision that limits the non-disclosure agreement so we can share safety lessons with other families without naming the hospital or staff members. The check arrives by courier on a Wednesday afternoon, and it's more money than I've ever seen in one place. It doesn't erase what happened or make the trauma worth it, but it does provide real security and validation that the hospital acknowledges they failed to protect us. Darren and I sit at the kitchen table that night and make a plan for the money. Most of it goes into a trust fund for Kyle's future needs, whether that's college or therapy or whatever else he might need as he grows up. We use some to pay off the credit card debt that piled up during the crisis when Darren was missing work, and I couldn't focus on anything. We put a chunk into our emergency fund, so we have a cushion if anything else goes wrong. It feels responsible and careful, like we're building stability instead of just reacting to chaos. 4 months after the abduction, Wu Logan calls with news that makes me cry in the middle of folding laundry. Misty successfully received a bone marrow transplant from the unrelated donor, the young man from another state who turned out to be a strong match. The transplant happened 2 weeks ago, and she's in the critical recovery phase now, which is risky and uncertain because her body could reject the new marrow, or she could develop serious complications. But she has a real chance now, a path forward that didn't exist before. Wu explains that transplant recovery takes months, and that her prognosis is still guarded, but that the donor's marrow is engrafting and producing new blood cells. I feel this genuine wave of relief that she got help through proper channels, that a stranger's generosity and the legitimate medical system gave her what my son never could have safely provided. It doesn't resolve my feelings about Dr. Kelly or make what she did okay, but it closes one painful loop in my mind. Misty is getting the care she needs without my family being involved, which is exactly what should have happened from the start. Dr. Kelly's criminal case moves toward resolution through a negotiated plea agreement that the prosecutor calls me to discuss before it's finalized. She'll plead guilty to reduced charges including attempted kidnapping, assault, and HIPAA violations, but the kidnapping charge will be downgraded to unlawful restraint, because the prosecutor thinks a jury might be sympathetic given the dying daughter situation. In exchange for the plea, she'll get 5 years of probation instead of prison time, mandatory mental health treatment, permanent surrender of her medical license, and 200 hours of community service. The prosecutor explains that a trial would be traumatic for Kyle, because he'd have to testify and be cross-examined, and that this outcome guarantees consequences without putting him on the witness stand. I struggle with whether this is enough justice, whether probation feels too light for someone who grabbed my child and drove away with him. But when I think about Kyle having to sit in a courtroom and answer questions about the scary doctor while she stares at him from the defense table, I know I can't put him through that. I tell the prosecutor I'll agree to the plea deal because protecting Kyle from further trauma matters more than punishing Dr. Kelly perfectly, even though part of me will always wonder if we let her off too easy. Darren and I sit in the counselor's office 2 weeks after the plea deal, both of us stiff in the uncomfortable chairs. The counselor asks us to describe one moment during the crisis when we felt most alone, and Darren says it was when I wouldn't let him help make decisions about Kyle's therapy. I feel defensive heat rise but force myself to listen as the counselor points out that we were both trying to protect Kyle in different ways. She gives us homework about checking in with each other before making big choices, and we practice the script right there in her office, stumbling over the words like we're learning a new language. Over the next several weeks, we keep showing up, even when it feels pointless, and slowly we start talking about fear without it turning into blame. The counselor helps us see that the real problem was never each other, but the impossible situation Dr. Kelly put us in. Darren admits he was scared I'd blame him for not seeing the signs sooner, and I admit I was scared he'd think I was a bad mother for letting it happen. We're both learning to say those fears out loud instead of letting them fester, and it's hard work, but we're both committed to fixing what broke between us. 5 months after everything started, I stand at the kitchen window on a Saturday afternoon and watch Kyle ride his bike up and down our driveway. His laughter carries through the open window, bright and carefree, and I feel something loosen in my chest. Darren is outside at the grill, flipping burgers, and the smell of charcoal and cooking meat fills the air with ordinary comfort. Kyle waves at his dad and does a wobbly turn, almost tipping over but catching himself, and they both laugh. I still check the locks twice before bed every night, and I still feel my shoulders tense when I see someone in a white coat at the store. But I also have moments like this where life feels almost normal again, where I can watch my son play without scanning for threats every 3 seconds. We're not the same family we were before all this happened, and sometimes I miss that innocent version of us that didn't know doctors could be dangerous. But we're learning to be okay with who we've become, building a new normal that includes both caution and joy. 6 months out from the abduction, I can finally see the whole picture with some clarity instead of just reacting to whatever crisis is happening right now. We survived something terrible and we're genuinely moving forward instead of just treading water. The criminal case is resolved with Dr. Kelly's plea deal. The civil settlement with the hospital is handled, and sitting in Kyle's trust fund, and Kyle is healing with his therapist's help every week. Our marriage is stronger for having faced the worst together and choosing to fix it instead of letting it break us. I still have hard days where the anger and fear come rushing back, usually triggered by something small like a doctor's appointment reminder or seeing a white coat. I know Kyle will carry some version of this experience forever, that it changed him in ways we won't fully understand until he's older. But we're not defined by what Dr. Kelly did to us anymore. We're defined by how we protected each other, how we sought help when we needed it, and how we refused to let trauma become our whole story. The locks are secure, the routines are solid, and we're building a future where safety and healing exist together with genuine hope. So yeah, Justice meant compromise because protecting a 6-year-old from cross-examination mattered more than maximum punishment. That's real-world choices, not movie justice. Subscribe if you want more stories about navigating impossible situations with no perfect answers. All right, I'm out. Stay aware, and I'll see you next time.